Because a lot of things that you had said back then had come to pass.
Well, this is what people say.
Wow. Let's talk also about your theory.
The crest theory?
The crest theory.
Well, the crest theory is a thesis about racism, white supremacy. And as I was explaining earlier, I got involved in this thinking when I was doing residency in general psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and encountering black patients that essentially had been cast to the side. You know, we're not really interested in the black patient. We're interested in other kinds of patients, namely white patients. And I don't think that that is uncommon, you know, as we look back on our historic experience, that people were not zeroing in and being interested. I mean, one could translate that today when we have a lot of black young people, young male people who are getting into difficulty with drugs and guns. And nobody looks at them and says, I wonder why these children are having these problems. They just lump it in the category of being bad and crime-ridden. Do you see? So that same attitude was what prevailed generally when I began training in psychiatry. And so I started, wait a minute, I'm a third-generation physician in my family. My father was a physician, his father was a physician. And I grew up with the attitude that your responsibility as a physician is to address the medical and health needs of your people, people like yourself. Not that you would exclude anybody, but your priority responsibility. And so I, you know, started talking to black patients in a psychiatric hospital, and I became impressed by the fact that racism was causing great distress in these lives. I mean, the patient wouldn't say, I'm being impacted, doctor, by racism. But they would describe what they had experienced, do you see, and understanding, well, this is a product of racism. So that racism was causing depression, causing drug use, and other kinds of problems that patients face. And so I said, let me understand it. To myself, I have to understand this if I'm going to really be effective as a physician. I mean, an effective physician doesn't just, oh, the patient has a cough. Oh, the patient is depressed, and write that down in your notes and give some medication. An effective physician, in my viewpoint, is a scientist who will say, what is causing this? Because only when you say, what is the etiology, what is the causation, can you move towards curing the problem, and most importantly, preventing it from going forward. And so I was looking for this answer, and had the very good fortune of meeting Mr. Neely Fuller, who Neely Fuller Jr., who is a citizen of the District of Columbia. And he, on his own, I met him following a Black Power committee meeting. That's back in the 60s, 1967 to be exact. And he was a person attending a meeting who, after I met him, I realized that he had been writing about this topic of racism going back to the Korean War when he was a soldier in the Korean War. And he said on a radar site in Japan, he started thinking about what was happening in the area of the world that we call the United States around the issue of color. And he started putting together his ideas, and when I met him and heard him talk about racism as a global system of power, where persons who classify themselves as white would maintain power over people who they classified as the non-whites, meaning the black, brown, red, and yellow people. And he said the system was operative in all areas of activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. And so that just blew my mind. I said, wow, that seems to be a very, very important idea. And after talking with him over a period of time, I started thinking, but why? Do you see? In other words,
why would they do this?
This is a new description of a very critical phenomenon on the planet Earth. I say that racism is the most important phenomenon that anybody can investigate and study, not for the purpose of putting anyone down, but again, scientifically. This is a critical phenomenon that is impacting the lives of the vast majority of people on this planet in a negative way, And so if we're going to have justice on the planet, so therefore we can have peace, somebody has to probe deeply and understand this problem. And so he had outlined this system. And I guess as a psychiatrist who's always wondering further about the why of behavior, so I thought, well, this seems to describe what I have experienced in my travels in the world, that you don't get away from racism. Racism is everywhere. If you go to Europe, it's there. If you go to Mexico, it's there. What would cause it? And that's how I got into my work, the crest theory, by going, I would say, I don't want to say deeper, but going to another level. Because Mr. Fuller, and this is his book, the textbook for victims of white supremacy.
Dynamic book, I must say,
A
too.
most powerful and dynamic book. And so I worked with him from 1967 to 1984
If I can
so that
quote-
we could publish this book. And, that was even something interesting. If somebody said, you work with this gentleman 17 years to make certain that his work is published, I would not have believed it at the time, but I was so impacted by the significance of what he had to say that I said, this has to be published. So we went through a number of twists and turns to bring it about, and it was a trip that took 17 years. But now the book is published, and I consider it to be one of the most important books of the 20th century. And my work just said, well, why would behavior be organized in this way, do you see, with white over non-white, or a tiny minority over the majority people on the planet? And I came up with the paper that's entitled The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation. Crest is my maiden name. I was married at the time. I think I was divorced, maybe. But I said, no, I will name this paper, give it my family name. And what I said in that paper is that the dilemma that the white minority population on planet Earth found itself in after we're sort of into now the voyages of discovery, the 500-year celebration of that.
Of the Columbus line.
But after persons, came out of Europe and circumnavigated the globe, and Columbus was at the lead of persons from Europe circumnavigating the globe. It had been done by other people, but this was the first time for European people. And he found that every place, not Columbus, but the other people who participated in the voyages of discovery, found out that every place they landed, there were people of color. And they also found out in a very short period of time that the people of color were genetically dominant. In other words, if you mix black plus white, your product is going to be colored because of the genetic dominance of the ability to produce melanin skin pigmentation and the genetic recessive character of the inability to produce melanin that allows skin to appear white or causes skin to appear white. And so that really is the basis of the crest theory of color confrontation and racism. So once I pulled those ideas together, and it's a short paper, 13 pages initially, the crest theory was, it was like opening up a door where you see, oh, wow, I never thought about the problem in this way, but once I start thinking about the problem in this way, then many, many things become clear. You see patterns of behavior that just seem peculiar.
Things just come to you.
It became clear why we were seeing such things as lynching, such things as justifiable homicide, such things as the inability to have gun control, or why people are interested in ball games. All of those things begin to become, oh, I understand this, within the framework of understanding racism, white supremacy in greater depth. And so I wrote a number of papers after presenting. The first paper I wrote was, as I said, The Crest Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism. And that paper was presented at the National Medical Association.
And you published this yourself.
And I published it myself. Do you see? And I advocate that. I am a general psychiatrist and child psychiatrist. I'm from Chicago, but I have been in Washington, D.C. since 1958 when I came to medical school at Howard University. and did all of my training in general psychiatry at St. Elizabeth's Hospital and child psychiatry at Children's Hospital here in Washington. And I have been interested. Things didn't start out that way, but I became interested in how to solve the mental health problems and other healthcare problems faced by black people. And I began to realize that until the problem of racism was solved, that black people were going to have difficulty as far as their health collectively, totally, is concerned. And I made up my mind, let me find out about racism.
Now, how many of your colleagues agree with you? How many know what you're saying is true and agree with you?
Well, I don't think I mean, I understand your question, but that's not an important consideration. In other words, when you step into new territory, the reason that you have to step into new territory is because other people haven't been there before you. So it would be like asking Einstein, if you will, well, do your colleagues agree with relativity theory? He felt that there was a vacuum in an area of understanding. He moved into the vacuum. Eventually, people caught up to what he had in mind.
As I find that as an artist, sometimes it's like that too. Because sometimes, not that you intend to be, but sometimes you have a tendency to be ahead of the pack, if you will.
Well, that you may not. You see, the artist who may step in a new direction doesn't say, "I am going to step into a new direction to be ahead of the pack." No, they are inspired or motivated or moved as an individual person to go in one direction, and it then becomes apparent that they are ahead of the pack.
I know, for instance, I did a piece.
As I move around, I mean, whenever I move around the city, and I started writing about racism effectively or thinking about it intensively in 1967 and started talking about it openly from 1970 following my writing about the crest theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. And now, whenever I move about town, I could be in Woody's, I could be at Union Station, I could be on the street. Somebody might come up to me and say, you know, let me shake your hand, or you don't know me, but I started hearing you talk in 1970, and I knew you were crazy. Do you see? But now, 20 years later, I understand what you were talking about. And so that's very interesting to me to have people say that, but it meant that you were talking about something in a manner that was unfamiliar, and people couldn't connect with it. But as the flow of time moves on, do you see, then you become right on time